the Transitions Academy and hear Will speak, I know why you're back today, because he has a lot of great information for us. So we'll turn it over to Will in just a minute, but a couple of housekeeping information for you. First of all, this will be recorded and archived. So if you're wondering about that, it will be for if you want to go back and listen to it again and or have colleagues that you'd like to share it with. Also, Will has already alerted us to the fact that he's going to have tasks for you today. So Bevan wants to make sure that I warn you that there's going to be a task later, which is great. We're so appreciative of Will being engaging on this webinar, but letting you know that he's going to have work for you to do, which is a fabulous thing. So you can ask questions, put those in the question box or the chat box, and we will help, we being Bevan and I, will help out fielding those questions for Will. So without further ado, let's turn it over to William S. Durden, Policy Associate for IBEST and Pathway Development from Washington. Thanks for being here, Will.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Bevan. It's really wonderful to be here. Continue to just let me know if any volume issues or if I end up speaking too fast or those kinds of things. But it's great to be back in the room virtually with Illinois, as Sarah mentioned. If you were at the session that we did recently, it was a pleasure to be able to share the similarities between the work that we're doing between Washington and Illinois and to continue that work together. And so it really is an honor and a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to more work together. As you heard, there will be a little bit of work, but it's all kind of self-contained in the presentation, and we'll kind of do it hand in hand, so I think it'll be a lot of fun. I do aim to make integration of standards and outcomes fun. Some people might not consider that an easy task, but I actually like how organized it is and what a clear package it creates for instruction. So I think there's a lot of benefits to doing this work. I'm going to do just a little bit of setup, and then we'll dive into the activity proper. I've already been introduced, so I think there's no need to belabor that. We know what IET is, so I don't need to belabor that as well, but we're going to notice the reason I'm bringing this up, even though I think that it is quite familiar for many, is that our outcomes and our standards do need to reflect these different activities: adult education and literacy activities, workforce preparation, and workforce training. So when you're designing or retooling an ICAPS program, you are thinking about the balance of those three things. And so I think it's worth remembering that those adult education and literacy activities, workforce preparation, and workforce training must be instructionally balanced, and that they must occur simultaneously, that they should include occupationally relevant instructional materials. And here's the big one, and this is straight from the legislation: have a single set of learning objectives that identify content in the three required areas, with the program activities organized to function cooperatively. So you'll see, to reiterate what I said earlier, when you've integrated your outcomes and standards and you've got those three components there, you've really created a package for what those program activities are going to be. So the outcomes and the standards really kind of run the show. And so that's why it's important to have a good process. So I will be sharing the Washington State process with you. I think that it's a clear and easy way to do the work. But I think, of course, you as a state and you as providers will continue to look at, take the best of what works for you and add to it in the way that makes the most sense for you. As I'm sure there are other ways that this work can be done. This is just how we've kind of come to it in our situation. So we'll remind ourselves that the ICAPS model does, call out those three things in a way. You've got career and you've got academic preparation. And then I think that just to jump back in the slides, those adult education and literacy activities we would tend to think of as more of that academic preparation. I'm just going to hop back and forth to compare those things. The workforce training is the career. And then the workforce preparation, I think, sometimes kind of straddles those two things. We can do some general workforce preparation around soft skills, or what WIOA calls employability skills, but those are often also best taught in the context of the specific career, because different careers, different industries require different kind of flavors of what those soft skills or what those employability skills are. So those workforce preparation activities really kind of float between the two callouts in your ICAPS model. some of your essential components of ICAPS. I've reviewed your literature, and I know there's other things that are important to it too, but these are the things that we share from state to state, and so I want to call them out. That this is about contextualization and it's about team teaching. We're not so much looking at the navigational support today, but the team teaching that oftentimes, can be that institutional lift to get the team in place and to support them. That all really flows from the contextualization. And the contextualization that we talk about, that we oftentimes see at a curricular level or at a teaching level, really begins with the integration of outcomes and standards. So we're doing that highest level work today to think about how that sets a program up for good success. To reiterate the value of contextualization and why we do this, not just to meet a requirement of the law, although that's always, of course, in play, but contextualization is really what makes basic education relevant for students. Anybody who sat down and read their Illinois state standards, and I think those share many features with the standards that we use in Washington state, I don't know too many working parents trying to attend school who would look at that book of standards and think, yeah, I want to dive into all that. I don't know that would motivate a lot of individuals. And so where those standards really come to life, though, and where they really become valuable is when they're contextualized to a program that actually does have interest and value for a student. And so when we take those critical adult ed standards that we know make such a difference for somebody, for their personal success and for their advancement in their life, and we match them up with the program outcomes in any of the content areas that you choose to ICAP or ICAPS, whether that's a welding program or a medical program or any of the range of programs that you offer. When we pair those standards up and create those integrated outcomes, it makes sense for the student because they understand why they're learning the basic skills. It makes sense for the basic skills instructor because they understand what they are teaching to in terms of the content area. And then the content expert gets to understand through this work what the value of adult education is. Sometimes, it's not always clear. Well, why is the second instructor coming into my classroom? What are we trying to accomplish? And I think when we take a look at the outcomes and the standards and see how they fit together, that can really help make a case for the value of the program. So a little bit more framing when we do this work of integrating standards. Collaboration is key. I like to remember that collaboration is to co-labor or to work together. And this quote for me is important. The process requires reflection, a stretch of your pedagogical muscles, if you will, a willingness to think in new ways and take risks, and an appreciation for the great educational diversity that makes up all institutions of learning. So that's a nice aspirational quote to help us as we launch into this. I like to keep in mind up front too, because this work, which is more back-end and yet has very much to do with what happens in the classroom, that we want to keep clear what the value of each instructor is in ICAPS and how this work contributes to that. Both instructors are vital for student success. Without content instruction in a career pathway, that's your welding instructor, your medical assistant instructor, students aren't going to reach their goals. And really the state's not going to meet the goals. The investment into this program is designed to create a strong return in workforce participation and in meeting those critical skill needs that we know all of our industries are scrambling for right now. Yet without the contextualized instruction in English, math, and adult education, we oftentimes focus on those hardcore standards of English and math, but we know so many other things happen in adult education: motivation, confidence building, barrier removal, all those types of things. And without that contextualized instruction, the content truly remains out of reach for the students. So it's really about those two things coming together to make student success a reality. So we know about the classic silos, and some of you who've worked with me have seen a version of this slide before, that adult ed is in its silo over here, and you've got prof tech and academic transfer and sometimes student services, and we kind of see all of these different areas on a campus. And then if you are an adult educator in a community-based organization, you feel a remove from there as well. ICAPS is about, and IBEST, the Washington State version, are really about kind of putting us together in the same silo. So we're really not in a silo anymore, but you've still got that visual representation. And at the highest level, you have the certificate or the degree that the student is attempting to earn that is going to help them land that living wage job or be on the first step of a career ladder that has growth potential with further certificates and degrees. And what starts to happen as we flow down from there is we have some parallel things happening. Let's go to our trusty welding department as an example. They've got their program outcomes. And then you've got your Illinois state standards. We see those as kind of on a parallel level. The standards that guide the work that we do in adult education are roughly parallel to the program outcomes in a welding pathway that oftentimes moves through a handful of certificates up to a degree. Down one level, we're now looking at individual courses. So from the program level down to the course level. And different people use different terms. I've seen different colleges in Washington State use different terms. So you might have your own language here, but oftentimes I hear student learning objectives or course objectives or course outcomes, but those are really something that has been described at the program level and then articulated down to individual courses, right? So now we're looking at the course level. And again, we have them in adult education, we have them in our content areas in our welding program, and they are separate, but they are parallel. It's really faculty, and I would say deans and directors who are invested in this work too, coming together at the level of those objectives and those outcomes both, and saying, where do they connect? And what do we want our students to be able to do outside the classroom? One of my favorite components of this work is that we're not just looking at classroom performance. It's one thing to say, this student has done well, they've turned in their assignments on time, their portfolio was neat, good attendance, all of those things. Those are all good things and good indicators for success. But when we build our programs, we're thinking about what are students able to do, not just when they're with us, when they're demonstrating, but when they're not with us, when they've moved on to a career or to further education and training. And so we're asking ourselves as we do this work together, what do we want our students to be able to do outside the classroom? And so as we align and integrate our outcomes and standards, we're doing that backward design of thinking, what is that end goal for the student? And how are we preparing the students in our classes for those end goals? Once that work is all done, we're theoretically going to move forward a few steps and say we've got all of our outcomes and standards integrated, and now we've got team teaching, and our faculty are going to co-develop assignments and work together to complete assessment. That's a story for another webinar, but that's how it all relates. So what I'm going to do now is walk you through a process. And it's a pretty streamlined process, and I think that it's pretty user-friendly, but we're going to work through it, and I'm definitely going to have room and time for questions before we have you give a try yourself. So the first thing that we want to do is we do want to identify program outcomes at the course level. So we're not going to try to align at the level of the certificate or degree. We're just going to take a course and say, this course has a handful of outcomes, 5 or 8 or 10 or whatever that may be. And we want to walk through those and read through those and make sure we know what they are. The example that we're going to use together today comes from a business technology, kind of a business office setting preparation. And I chose that example simply because I thought it was something that we could all relate to. I think most, if not all of us, need to use the Windows environment. We use a desktop or a laptop. Most in the public sector don't use Macs, it's mostly Windows. And so we're familiar with this content versus maybe a welding program that I have been using previously as an example, but when we get to the course level, many of us probably would feel lost right away talking about welding outcomes whereas I think business technology outcomes are a little bit more user-friendly for a wide audience. So we're going to look at some business tech outcomes, and we're going to sort of think about what those are. And then we're going to analyze, and eventually, again, down the road, it's helpful to actually know your standards and to have an awareness of what some of the biggies are for Illinois, those adult ed standards. And we're going to analyze and think about how do those standards relate to the program course outcomes, and we'll do some practice with that together. Then we'll select the appropriate standards for contextualization. This is a question that has come up for me many times in many states and many programs. People will say, do we have to somehow try to get all of our state standards into a program? That seems impossible. And I always say, yes, that would be impossible. You actually just need to select the standards that make sense and that relate to the program course outcomes. Oftentimes you will have those go-to standards that you tend to use again and again and again because you just get a lot of bang for your buck from those standards, and that makes sense. So we'll select the appropriate standards for contextualization. We won't bring in standards that don't make sense or don't relate to the program outcomes. And then we can revise the wording as appropriate. I'll guide you through all of these steps. Revise wording as appropriate to match the program course outcomes. A point that I like to keep clear is that we never change, in Washington State, in our process, we would never change the program outcomes themselves. We don't touch the language, we don't do anything to them. Those program outcomes were set oftentimes through a process with accreditation, tied to a national standard or an industry standard. And ICAPS and IBEST, our two state models, we're not attempting to change those. We're helping students meet those outcomes, and we're using our adult education standards to be that scaffolding or that bridge that gets students up to that outcome. It's really about making the adult ed standard, which is oftentimes implicit in the outcome, and making it explicit by really calling it out and giving it space. So we'll give some examples in just a moment for how to do that. The last thing that I want to say for setup for this is that I am choosing to work with standards on the kind of so-called ABE ASE side of the house, but you can do these with ESL standards equally. I'm just choosing one set for simplicity's sake, for demonstration's sake, but the process would be the same whether you're doing an ESL focus or an ABE focus. And you could probably do both too, but we'll at the same time, but we'll really just do one today. So the first step, business tech, office tech, is to identify the program course outcomes. I'm giving you a theoretical, these are actually real outcomes from a program, but we're treating them as just sort of theoretical outcomes. And I've given you 2 out of a potential, again, 6 or 8 or 10. And if you look at that first one, it says, create and manage files in a Windows environment. Okay. And then the second one, identify and select the appropriate software tool to solve business problems and achieve needs. And I've only given you 2, but if we were to look at the whole list, we could go down them all and just, come to terms basically with what these outcomes are. I know when I was an instructor, team teaching in IBEST in our state system, that was one of the first things that I wanted to know with my co-teacher who had program outcomes, is I just wanted to see them. What are your program outcomes? I'm not going to start with your 600-page textbook. That's going to overwhelm me right away. I'm going to start with your outcomes and start to get to know what are those high-level targets that you have set for your course. And so that's what we're doing right now, is just coming to terms with those. And we're really just going to focus on one, nice and simple. Create and manage files in a Windows environment. So everybody kind of together with me, I think just picture that outcome. What does that mean? Well, if I could show you the rest of my desktop, you would see that my file management system is so-so. I kind of have some files all over the place on my desktop, and I probably could clean those up and organize them a little bit better, right? So if I were to take this class, I would learn a system. I would learn a method for creating and managing files in a Windows environment. That'd probably be really good for me and probably many of us, right? So we're looking at that standard and we're saying, okay, that's something that the student needs to learn and that they're going to learn how to do in this class and that they have to do in order to be successful. Apologies, I've got a phone ringing. I've shut that off. So that won't be a problem anymore. And so we've looked at that outcome. And now we're thinking to ourselves, and this is where I said, remember, it can be helpful to know your standards. we want to think about what do we teach in adult education that would scaffold, support, and bridge students up to being able to create and manage files in a Windows environment. And so I went to, just for this demonstration, I went to some standards in Washington State. And then when we go to practice, we'll use the Illinois State standards. But I went to this reading, what we call an anchor here. And I went to, and we have different indicators. This is a large table, I know, but you've got it says reading CCR anchor 3. That's really the standard. And then levels A through E are indicators that the student is meeting the standard. And A is the most simple, or the most accessible. And then E is more complex. And I went to that more complex one where it says follow precisely, the one that I've highlighted in the orange box, follow precisely a complex multi-step procedure when carrying out experiments, taking measurements, or performing technical tasks, attending to special cases or exceptions defined in the text. And I chose that through an analytical process by thinking about how it would relate to the pathway course outcome. And there's a lot of language in that standard, and it doesn't all fit create and manage files in a Windows environment. But I thought to myself, and if I was in dialogue with a co-faculty member, you know, if a student is going to learn how to create and manage files in a Windows environment and to do that successfully, it makes sense that they would have to follow precisely a complex multi-step procedure, because there's going to be a certain way and a process that they have to do that. And that really is an adult education standard, because in my memory working with students, in just following steps, we think that's so simple, but maybe in our own lives even, we don't always do that. Oh, I don't really understand step 3, I think I'll skip it. Oh, I'm not really gonna preview the steps, I'm just gonna dive right in and take one at a time and just see how it goes, right? And so in adult education, we can teach students how to slow down, read assignments from start to finish, think through what the steps are, ask questions about the steps that they don't understand, etc. Right? So I'm thinking, okay, that should pair pretty well with creating and managing files in a Windows environment, because they're going to have to follow a process in order to do that. I'm going to mute for a second and just clear my throat. All right, thanks so much. So the other piece of this, as I mentioned, there was a lot of language in that standard, and not all of it related, right? Only some of it did. So you see where I've crossed out language? That's where I'm revising the standard so that it's more tidy, it's more compact, and it's only the part that's really relevant to the outcome. So in this next slide, it's kind of that final step where I've modified the standard so that it most neatly fits the outcome. And again, a reminder, I have not changed the outcome in any way. That's the same, create and manage files in a Windows environment. And on the adult education side of the house, follow precisely a complex multi-step procedure when performing technical tasks. So take a moment with me and just notice what we've done. This is kind of my own language for describing this. What we've really created is an instructional package. And two teachers working together can see, okay, I'm the office tech instructor, and it's my job to teach students how to create and manage files in a Windows environment. And okay, I'm the adult ed instructor, and it's my job to help students with the learning process that's going to allow them to meet that outcome. They're going to learn how to follow precisely a complex multi-step procedure when performing a technical task. From there, and again, this is a topic for another webinar, but from there you start thinking, okay, well, how do we design the assignment? How are we going to assess it? And it all starts to make sense. This is a great moment for me to just pause and see if folks have any questions. Does this process seem clear so far? Have my instructions been clear, or have there been spaces where things haven't made sense or have seemed left out? I just want to do kind of a temperature gauge and see where folks are at.
So, well, we don't have any standing questions, but just to remind everybody, you can pose a question either through the question or through the chat if you do want some clarification from Will.
Thank you, Sarah. And certainly if I don't see anything, that I'm fine to go on. But you know,
Yeah.
I'll give folks a few seconds if anybody has a thought or a question they'd like to pose.
Okay, so we do have a couple of questions. One is, what NRS level of standards are you using? And question 5 or 6?
Yeah, great question. My tags won't make as much sense to you, that RST 9, 10.3, because those were correlated to high school standards. So I believe those were like grade levels 9 and 10. When we do the activity, we're going to use your state standards and you're going to see the level because I kept the tags in. But we tend to work in the upper levels, as you would imagine. So it can usually vary anywhere from an NRS level 4 to 6 is what I would typically see and typically work with.
Great. And also there is some feedback. This is very clear, easy to follow, good way to explain to instructors what their roles are. So thank you for that positive affirmation. Thank you, Will, for being clear and easy to follow.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That's nice to hear that we're on target so far. So with that said, let's assume that that's the norm and that people are feeling like, yeah, this process makes sense and we understand why we're doing it and how to do it. So we're going to do a little practice together. It's kind of just like a matching game, but it'll take us a few minutes to come to terms. So here's a whole bunch of text and I'm going to break it down for you. I went to a business technology program and gathered some outcomes. So that's on the left-hand side. And for clarity, we're just going to look at these four each in their own space. Graduates will be prepared for entry-level positions as a business support professional, your entry-level office admin type job. They will carry out office administration procedures and management support using office technology. They will use Microsoft Office software to produce complex integrated documents and spreadsheets. And they will identify good customer service skills and work well with internal and external customers. Great. So we're getting to know our business tech program. On the right-hand side, and yes, I did go to the Illinois state standards through my own analytical work. So I did that work for us. We're not going to try to produce that together as a group today. Through my own analytical work, I grabbed some standards that I felt each could relate and make sense for the four outcomes. And I'll go ahead and read those real quickly. So one is that students will actively interface with technology at both the hardware and software levels. They'll perform job-seeking activities on the computer. They'll evaluate a speaker's point of view, reasoning, and use of evidence or rhetoric, assessing the stance, premises, links among ideas, word choice, points of emphasis, and tone used. And they will manage their own and work group schedules and contacts. So remember, these are all standards from the adult education side of the house. They weren't specifically designed to match up with business technology, but we, through our own powers of reasoning, can see where they will relate and complement and support the standard. Now, what I didn't do, of course, for the activity's sake, is I didn't actually pair them up appropriately. So that first adult education standard isn't necessarily the one that would align to the first bullet point in business technology, if that makes sense. So what I'd like folks to do, and I picture this being probably 3 to 5 minutes, but however much time is needed, to sit with these for a moment and to make some guesses or make some thoughts about which adult education standard best fits which business technology outcome. And it'll be one-to-one. There will be one for each, one adult education standard for each business technology outcome. So I'm going to go ahead and give kind of a, let's start with just a 2 to 3 minute pause, give people a chance to think about what's the best fit for each one. I do have my own answers, but you might come to a different conclusion, and that could be okay too. There's no secret guidebook behind the scenes that tells us what the right answer is. We don't have the back of the math book with the right answers. So we really are just making our own educated guesses about what makes the most sense. So let's go ahead and do that together and see if we can find which one goes with which. Folks, I'm checking in. It's been just a couple minutes. You might still be working through this, or you might feel like you've kind of got your best guesses lined up and you're curious to see the next step. So I'm going to take another 10, 15 seconds. Please type something in if you're saying, hey, we really need another minute, or yeah, we're good to go. I don't want to leave anyone behind. Okay, in the absence of any specific feedback, I'm going to go ahead and move forward. Just pipe up if you need us to take a step back. And let's see how we all match up. This is a little messy, but the next slide will clean it up. I just wanted to show you, as in my thinking, if a graduate needs to be prepared for entry-level positions as a business support professional, it would make sense that they would perform some job-seeking activities on the computer to relate to that. I really like that because it can be kind of a frustration of mine when we're expected to teach job-seeking activities when a student hasn't built the skills that would allow them to really perform that successfully. But if it's in tandem with a career, you're seeing how the workforce preparation activity lines up with the actual content in the career. So I really like that one. The second outcome, carry out office administration procedures and management support using office technology. I envisioned that a student, eventually the office worker, would need to manage their own and probably some other schedules and contacts. And so that would help them with those admin procedures and management support to learn how to do that. For a student to learn to use Microsoft Office software to produce complex integrated documents and spreadsheets, I could see that as being an active interface with technology at the software level. Notice we don't have to meet every target in the standard as long as the standard supports the outcome. So no, the Microsoft Office software outcome does not include hardware, but that's okay. And then finally, identifying good customer service skills and working well with both internal and external customer, to me, relates to a student's ability to evaluate where a speaker's coming from, what they're trying to communicate, tone, are they upset, are they excited, are they depleted, you know, what's their energy level, those kinds of things. So that's how I envisioned matching these up. Again, if you came up with a couple different answers, I definitely could see another way or two that this could go, and there's no necessarily right or wrong answer. This work really comes down to the faculty working together to say what makes sense, what really works. And then, of course, program deans and directors having their input as well, sometimes having a little bit more of that programmatic point of view for things that need to get covered. So it can be a combination of expertise to get these steps done. Here I've lined them up so that they're clean and each adult education standard is next to the outcome that I identified for them. And here's that final step that I mentioned where you can revise the wording as appropriate in the adult education standard to match the outcome. So notice, I kind of call it like the next step or the final step of contextualization to say, how can we make sure that that standard, I think from both the instructor and the student point of view, really fits the outcome. So I've added perform job-seeking activities on the computer. I've added the relevance of in order to obtain an entry-level position in a business office, because we don't want students performing job-seeking activities that have nothing to do with the career pathway that they're studying in, right? We would want it to relate to that. So we don't have to make that explicit, but I think it helps to make that explicit. And so that orange text is just my own language to define the relevance. The second one, manage own and work group schedules and contexts. Again, that could happen anywhere, but we're talking about in an office environment. So we're making that clear again, that that's how that relates. I probably could have modified the next set where it says use Microsoft Office to produce complex documents and spreadsheets. I could say actively interface with technology at the software level and just take out hardware, but there might be another component of the course that does ask the students to work with the hardware. So maybe if I had the rest of the outcomes and I did the full work of integrating the course, I might have a place where that standard could relate to more than one outcome, in which case I would want to keep the language. So I think that would be kind of a wait and see. And certainly you can use one adult education standard to pair up with more than one outcome. It doesn't always have to be one-to-one. For example, if I have a standard, we have one in Washington State, something like read with understanding or read with comprehension. That's a pretty big standard that you get a lot of purchase from, and it relates to so many different areas that we might see ourselves using some of those same standards again and again. And then the final one, identify good customer service skills. I simply changed evaluate a speaker's point of view because that's so broad to evaluate a customer's point of view to really relate to the field. So hopefully you'll see what we've done there in terms of being able to modify the language so that they fit. So I'm kind of skipping back and forth and thinking for a second here. Let's talk about what next steps would be. If you, again, are either starting a new ICAPS program, or maybe you're kind of revitalizing or taking a second look at one, again, just to remind you the steps that we've covered, you want to identify your course outcomes, make sure you're clear on what those are, and that you've got some grasp of them. I'm sort of speaking at that dean and director level, or a faculty member in adult ed, kind of come into terms with those. Of course, our content faculty will know them because they are already teaching to them. And then analyzing again how and which, really I should say, which adult ed standards will relate to those program course outcomes. Again, that's where I think that having that knowledge base of what your standards are, and also your student population, do we need to focus more on the ESL standards because of who our students are, or do we need to focus more on the ABE, ASC? Selecting those appropriate standards for contextualization. And then again, and your state might make a different choice, but in our state, the process is that we are able to revise the wording of our adult ed standards as appropriate to match up with those program course outcomes. So I think this might also be a good kind of comprehension check moment to see if anybody has any questions about the process or about the brief activity that we did to try to kind of flesh it out and make it come to life. Any feedback at this step?
Will, as people are putting in their feedback, let me just kind of add, because I can see that some of our educators that are on are, because they're very familiar with the content standards in Illinois, are thinking, yeah, and we could do this. And so I'm just thinking what you're suggesting here would be a great group activity of a bunch of teachers sitting around and saying, yes, and we could do this too, and we could do, you know, adding that in. So thanks for leading us through that.
Thank you. It's a great kind of a workshop activity to really dive in.
Right, right. So somebody made the comment, this makes a lot of sense, but she's wondering how long of a process is this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's a great question. I think the more you know your standards already, the easier that will go. I think if for example, if I was an adult ed instructor and maybe, you know, I tend to teach the same levels and I don't know all the standards, you know, that might be some work. That might be time where a program director might come in who has a little bit more experience knowing the standards, or whoever that may be. But I think if everybody involved in the process already knows their areas well, you'll get a lot of rich conversation out of it. I do think that it's the kind of thing that you have to set some limits on, just for time and for moving forward, because it is rich and there's a lot of depth to it. I think you could do hours and hours and hours. I don't think that's necessarily the best thing. I think it's probably better to say, okay, here's our outcomes. Which standards make the most sense? Let's line them up and not get too, you know how it can be with wordsmithing, you know, not get too bogged down in the nitty gritty, but just find the ones that make sense. So I think that is wise, especially as we want to make sure that folks are compensated for any time that seems out of scope of contract or whatever for extra duties, that we want to kind of limit what those hours would be. It's hard for me to really guess, but I think that in my experience when I did this, my co-teacher and I met. we talked about the outcomes and I kind of threw a few ideas out there. I kind of ended up actually being the one to go back and do a little bit more of the matching up on my own. And then I came back to my co-teacher and said, well, what do you think about this choice that I made? Or what do you think about that? So it was sort of just a couple, I would say, we probably had 2 1 to 2 hour meetings to really work through it together. And then I probably spent an additional 2 to 3 hours on my own time to kind of flesh some things out. If you truly workshopped it all together, which I recommend, I think that's the best way to do it. I think you could hammer these out in a half-day workshop or in a 3/4 day workshop, I think.
Thanks, Will. And then also we've had a comment that just that this is good as they develop bridge courses, not just for IET, but any contextualized course. It's great for both applications. So thanks for pointing that out. And you know, and I would also make the case that as if you are a teacher who's doing this work that Will is laying out, that it would be very helpful to share with other teachers within your program so they understand the importance of contextualization, whether they're officially supposed to be doing it or not, as Will laid out those reasons at the beginning of how contextualization is really good for our students, for their understanding. It might be very helpful for the other adult ed teachers to see the value of this work.
Great points. I love that it gets us out of the trap of trying to come to terms with somebody's curriculum, because I think that's sometimes a go-to and people stall out like, I just don't know all this content. You don't have to. It really starts with the outcomes. Okay, any other comments for review or should we move forward?
That's all we have at this point.
Great. So we're really kind of forecasting now. That's the bulk of the work. But what I want us to think about, and we will spend a little time actually forecasting a little bit, another 3 to 5 minutes. Let's say the work is done. You have a complete package of integrated outcomes and standards for an ICAPS program. Yay. The next step, again, future casting, it would be to then think about what does that mean in the classroom? How does that start to play out in assignments and assessments that really help students to meet the outcomes? So we're going to preview this work with some thoughts as to what those assignments and assessments could be. So what I want people to do with me, just kind of an imagination exercise. Here they are again. I've changed the orange text on the right so that it's now very seamless and it's all just looks like official language that always was that way. And what different folks could do is just pick one pair, one package. Like I just want to focus on use Microsoft Office and actively interface. And ask yourself, what would an assignment be? What would a class activity be that would help students to start to meet that outcome? In fact, I know I'm going to work with that last one. I really liked the idea of helping students to identify good customer service skills by evaluating a customer's point of view and all of those other things. You might take a few of those words out too in the final package, but just to give you an example, when I look at that, I think, you know, I think the team teachers could role play a scenario. And I think that they could role play a scenario where you have a customer who maybe is frustrated. And that customer is trying to explain why they're frustrated, but because their emotional level is heightened, maybe they're leaving out some details or they're not explaining it in a way that makes you understand how you can really help them. And so the two teachers are going to kind of demonstrate that exchange. The activity for the students is to watch that exchange and to try to point out, to evaluate that customer's point of view. Okay, well, I'm looking at their points of emphasis and they said X or Y or Z. And I think that means that they're trying to get an answer to a problem. And their tone, their voice is kind of loud. They're speaking kind of quickly and in short sentences. They seem frustrated, right? And so the students can evaluate the customer's point of view and what they're trying to establish. And in doing so, through that activity, that's a practice at identifying good customer service skills, active listening, understanding the point, all of those types of things. So that's the activity that I want us to do now is to, you could continue to work with that pair that I just demoed or with one of the other threes. Try to imagine what it would look like in the classroom. and see if you can come up in discussion with each other, or if you're on your own, kind of a brief moment in a classroom that would help to work with that outcome and that standard. So we'll take just a minute or two to do that together. Okay, just kind of a check-in. Of course, you might be in the middle of some really rich conversation, or maybe you finished it quickly and are just waiting. So it's wherever you are in that. Let's take a moment and see if anybody. Well, that might be a little bit hard to do. I'm curious to know what people came up with, but that might be hard to really explain a scenario in a chat box. So maybe that's not the best idea. But I would be interested over time to kind of find out what people are thinking with this.
I will. We have Claire Sullivan from COD. I'm going to try to unmute her if that's okay with you, because she's had a couple of things to add. Mary Claire, putting you on the spot. Hopefully you have a microphone. Can you share with us what you wrote in the chat box? Well, maybe we can't because she's unmuted. We're not hearing her. And I didn't clear that with her ahead of time. So, but she's giving some collaborative discussions, demonstrate active listening skills. And earlier she's coming up with some additional standards that work with these. And I think that point of earlier, that when this is done collaboratively, especially with people that have a good understanding of and they're actually using these standards on a daily basis, I think this activity will be a pretty easy addition to them to show how this could be matched with the integrated discussions.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. It was Claire who gave that feedback.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's great. Yeah. If we're picturing like a face-to-face workshop session, this is where you start generating all those ideas and getting that buzz out for how this could impact the classroom. So that's great. Let's see. Well, we're nearing that time. Okay, that actually is the last slide that I have. Again, just notice that future casting. We can pause and just say, okay, right now we're really focusing on the outcomes and standards, but I want you to see where that leads. It will naturally flow into that next step of that classroom and that course design. And then even after that, get into the assessments of how do we do assessments together. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves. Right now, we're thinking about integrating standards and outcomes. And in close, I'd be happy to entertain any questions about the process, any related issues that we could discuss in our final minutes together.
And Will, just to add on, Michelle came up with an activity of student inputs, activities, and times into an online group calendar. So thank you for sharing that. And yeah, it was Mary Claire, whose speaker wasn't working, but came up with some great additions. So thank you to everybody who was really applying what Will's sharing with us today.
Thank you.
That's all I'm seeing at this point. If I maybe give a minute and see if anybody has any additional questions or comments, but that's all that's up at this point.
Okay. Well, I always say 50 minutes is an educational hour, so yeah.
And so I will tell you, Will, that we're getting some great comments saying this was excellent. Thank you very much to you. Also, we have fabulous news for everybody because Will is willing to let us share these slides with all of the attendees. So all of you that are putting up some great thank you, it was very helpful. That will be coming your way. And then also, as we mentioned earlier, this will be archived. So if you want to share, and I strongly encourage you go back and share this with all of your educational staff, and again, more than just your IET, more than just your bridge, but all your teachers understanding how they can contextualize every single day.
Awesome.
A lot of wonderful thank yous, and this is really helpful, but I think that we did not look like we have any questions for you, Will. So we will also, Bevan and I will also say thank you very much for sharing this with all of the fine folks in Illinois, for helping us raise the level of all of our boats. And it looks like everybody's looking forward to the next conversation and getting this as a resource for them. So thank you, Will, and thank you to everybody who has joined us today for this webinar.
Thank you, Will.
Thank you all. What a pleasure to do this work together.
So we're going to go ahead and end the webinar, but everyone have a great day.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.